2:47 on a Tuesday morning, in March 2023, a Land Rover Defender disappeared from a residential street in Cheshire. The entire operation took 22 seconds. No broken glass, no alarm, no forced entry. Two men approached the vehicle, one holding a small electric device, roughly the size of a television remote. The device intercepted the signal from the key fob inside the house, relayed it to a second device held at the car door, and the Defender unlocked, as if its owner were standing there. By the time the men were 100 meters down the road, they had already begun the relay process to program a blank key. By morning, the vehicle was in a container yard on the outskirts of Birmingham. Within 72 hours, it was on a vessel bound for West Africa. The theft was not an isolated incident. It was a transaction, one of an estimated 130,000 vehicle theft offences recorded across England and Wales in 2023, a figure that represents a 25% increase over the previous 3 years and the highest sustained level since the early 2000s. Industry estimates, including data published by the Association of British Insurers, suggest the aggregate value of vehicles stolen in Britain now exceeds £1 billion annually. Insurance fraud linked to vehicle crime adds several hundred million more. But the scale alone does not explain why this story matters. What matters is the architecture behind it. The modern car theft industry in Britain is not opportunistic. It is not disorganized. It is a structured, technology-dependent, internationally connected criminal supply chain, with logistics networks, export routes, money laundering infrastructure, and a clear division of labor between the people who steal, the people who move, and the people who profit. It has been built in large part because the systems designed to stop it, regulators, manufacturers, ports, and law enforcement, have each responded to their individual piece of the problem, while nobody has held the full picture. What follows is an account of how a criminal industry worth over £1 billion a year was constructed in plain sight, and why, despite being well documented and extensively reported, it continues to operate with remarkable efficiency. Britain largely solved its car theft problem once before. Through the 1980s and early 1990s, vehicle crime was epidemic. Joyriding was ubiquitous. Insurance fraud was widespread. By 1992, over 600,000 vehicles were stolen annually in England and Wales alone. The response was broadly effective. Immobilizers became mandatory on new vehicles from 1998. Insurance companies increased premiums on high-risk models, and police dedicated significant resources to vehicle crime units. By the mid-2000s, theft figures had fallen by nearly 80%. That success created a false sense of resolution. Police vehicle crime units were scaled back. Insurance companies reduced their investigative capacity. Manufacturer investment in security broadly plateaued. The problem appeared to have been solved by technology, and to a significant extent, it had been. But the technology had also created its own vulnerability. Modern vehicles are not mechanical objects secured by mechanical locks. They are networked computer systems, and the convenience features built into those systems, keyless entry, push-button start, remote connectivity, introduced attack surfaces that the security infrastructure of the 1990s was never designed to address. The criminals understood this before the manufacturers did, and certainly before the regulators did. The gap between what the vehicles offered and what the security protocols protected became, by the 2010s, a systematic opportunity. The contemporary British vehicle theft operation has 3 distinct tiers, each with its own specialization and its own connection to the tier above. At the base are the theft teams, typically small groups of 2 to 4 individuals operating in concentrated geographic areas, using relay attack devices, signal amplifiers, and OBD port programming tools sourced through online supply chains, many of them originating in Eastern Europe and China. These devices are not classified as illegal to own in the United Kingdom. They are sold commercially, ostensibly for automotive locksmiths and vehicle recovery professionals. The legal ambiguity is structural. A relay attack device costs between £100 and £600. A single stolen Land Rover or Range Rover, the 2 most targeted vehicles in Britain consistently, year after year, has a street value of between £30,000 and £80,000 on export markets in West Africa, the Middle East and Eastern Europe. The return on investment is extraordinary, and the barriers to entry are low. Above the theft teams sit the logistics networks, the chop shops, the container yards, the freight forwarders who arrange export documentation. This is where the operation becomes more complex and more embedded in legitimate commercial infrastructure. Stolen vehicles move through a documented process. Immediately after theft, high-value targets are taken to secure locations, often commercial premises with legitimate business registrations, where identification numbers are altered, documentation is manufactured, and vehicles are either broken into parts for the secondary market or prepared for export. The parts market is substantial. A stolen Range Rover broken for spares yields comparable or greater value than the vehicle sold whole, with considerably lower risk of detection. Export is the crown of the operation. Britain's port infrastructure processes millions of container movements annually. The volume is, practically speaking, unmonitorable at current resourcing levels. Border force seizures represent only a small percentage relative to overall container volume. Industry estimates suggest that a substantial proportion of exported stolen vehicles leave Britain undetected. The third tier is financial. The proceeds of large-scale vehicle theft require laundering, and the infrastructure for that process is well established. Cash-intensive businesses, cryptocurrency, trade-based money laundering through the same freight networks used for export. This is where vehicle crime intersects with organized crime more broadly, and where the financial flows become genuinely difficult to trace. The data documenting this resurgence was available early and unambiguous. By 2019, Tracker, one of Britain's principal stolen vehicle recovery companies, was reporting year-on-year increases in relay attacks on keyless entry vehicles. The National Police Chiefs Council had documented the trend. The insurance industry was absorbing rising claims costs and beginning to reprice accordingly. Thatcham Research, the automotive security testing body funded by insurers, was publishing detailed analyses of manufacturer vulnerabilities. The response from vehicle manufacturers was, with limited exceptions, slow, incremental, and commercially reluctant. Introducing meaningful countermeasures to keyless entry systems requires design changes that affect manufacturing costs and, in some cases, the user experience features that premium manufacturers market as differentiators. Ultra-wideband technology, which can prevent relay attacks by detecting the physical proximity of the key fob, was available and understood by the mid-2010s. Implementation across vehicle ranges took the better part of a decade, and in several major manufacturers remains incomplete. The regulatory framework governing vehicle security in Britain operates through type approval standards set at an international level, the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, whose protocols are then adopted domestically. Amending those standards is a lengthy multilateral process with significant industry input. The gap between an identified vulnerability and a mandated response can run to years. Meanwhile, the exploitation of those vulnerabilities was measured in seconds. Specialist vehicle crime units were reduced over time as overall theft rates declined. Vehicle crime, while costly in aggregate, produces investigations that are resource-intensive, technically demanding, and frequently cross-jurisdictional. The organized networks behind large-scale theft are structured specifically to limit individual exposure. The person who steals the car knows nothing of the export chain. The freight forwarder has no knowledge of the theft team. Prosecution requires connecting those layers, a task that demands sustained investigative capacity that most police forces do not currently maintain for vehicle crime specifically. The clearest public accounting of the scale and structure of British vehicle crime came not from the government or law enforcement, but from the insurance industry and investigative journalism. A 2023 investigation by Auto Express, corroborated by data from the DVLA and insurance sector claims analysis, mapped the concentration of vehicle theft geographically. West Midlands, Greater London and the North West accounting for a disproportionate share of total recorded theft, and traced the destination markets for exported vehicles through registration data in Nigeria, Ghana and Dubai. The patterns were not ambiguous. Specific makes and models were being stolen at rates that suggested organized targeting rather than opportunistic crime. Several major ports, including Tilbury, Southampton and Bristol, appeared in enforcement actions and recovery operations, reflecting their role in the broader freight volumes rather than any institutional failing on their part. The criminal geography of the industry was, to anyone willing to take a look at the data, reasonably legible. Operation Lionheart, a national crime agency-led operation targeting organized vehicle crime networks in 2022 and 2023, produced a series of arrests and seizures. It also illustrated the structural challenge. Dismantling one network does not address the supply chains, the export infrastructure, or the technology that enables it. Within weeks of significant enforcement actions, theft rates in targeted areas typically recover. The fundamental exposure is this. Britain has a well-documented, high-value criminal industry operating inside a regulatory and enforcement environment that is structured to address pieces of it. Individual thieves, individual shipments, individual networks, rather than the system as a whole. The consequences distribute unevenly, as they typically do. For individual vehicle owners, the experience is not merely financial. For many people, particularly those in areas of concentrated theft activity, it has reshaped daily behavior, where they park, where they drive, whether they use their own driveways. The psychological weight of repeated vehicle theft, and in high-risk areas, repeat victimization rates are significant, is difficult to quantify but consistently reported. The financial cost is ultimately socialized through the insurance markets. Premiums on keyless entry vehicles, particularly Land Rover and Range Rover products, have risen sharply. In some postcodes, comprehensive insurance on high-risk models has become prohibitively expensive. Owners of vehicles they cannot insure affordably either self-insure or bear the full replacement risk, or sell. depressing values in precisely the segments the criminal market targets most heavily. For manufacturers, the reputational and commercial consequences have been real if managed. Land Rover's public association with vehicle theft in Britain reached a point at which the company issued formal statements and invested in accelerated security upgrades. The reputational damage to a brand built substantially on premium positioning is significant, though the long-term commercial impact remains contested. For organized crime, the consequences have been manageable. The industry continues. What makes the British vehicle theft crisis analytically interesting is not its scale, but its predictability. Every element of the failure was documented before the failure occurred. The vulnerabilities in keyless entry technology were known. The export routes were known. The inadequacy of port-level enforcement relative to container volumes was known. The reduction in specialist police capacity followed logically from falling theft statistics that no longer justified the resource. The regulatory lag between identified vulnerability and mandated response was an acknowledged feature of the international approval process. What was absent was not information. What was absent was a single institutional actor with both the mandate and the capacity to treat vehicle crime as a system rather than a series of individual incidents. Manufacturers were responsible for vehicle security, but not for port enforcement. Police are responsible for enforcement, but not for manufacturer standards. Port authorities are responsible for freight movement, but not for vehicle identification. Insurers absorb the financial cost, but have limited direct leverage over any of the other actors. Regulators set standards, but operate on timescales that bear no relationship to the speed of criminal adaptation. The result is a system in which accountability is distributed so widely that no single failure is attributable to any single actor, and no single actor has sufficient incentive to solve the problem comprehensively. This is a familiar structure. It appears in financial regulation, in environmental oversight, in supply chain governance. It is the architecture of a problem that everyone acknowledges, nobody owns, and the people it harms most have the least power to change. The vehicle stolen in Cheshire in March 2023 was never recovered. The insurance claim was settled. The premium renewed at a higher rate. The container that carried it across the channel was one of several million processed that year. Britain's car theft industry is not invisible. It is not particularly sophisticated in its underlying logic. It is sustained principally by the gap between the scale of the problem and the institutional will to treat it as one. When that gap is permitted to persist long enough, it stops being a gap and becomes a market.